Man is always something more than what he knows of himself. He is not what he is simply once and for all, but is a process. iTrustCapital allows their clients to invest in crypto through an individual retirement account or an IRA. IRAs are tax-sheltered accounts, which means all of your crypto trading is tax-free and can even grow tax-free over time. It's free to open an account and there are no hidden fees. You don't have to pay a monthly subscription or a membership fee either. If you use my link iTrust.capital/Darren, you can get up to $100 funding reward just by using my link. So be sure to research IRAs and iTrustCapital.
Overall framework, the global framework that was developed after the Second World War has just collapsed. We are really in the midst of a global crisis, but it's mainly a crisis of the institutions that were built. And we've just heard about the non-alignment movement, things like that have come to be, in a way, not very much prized by the larger countries. I think that what can emerge now is a bottom-up process, and the BRICS framework is really favorable for that kind of perspective.
Fiat has an average lifespan of 27 years. The fiat system that we have has been proven to be a failure. This time is not different. When you have a currency that can be debased, it will be, and eventually paper returns to its intrinsic value.
And here it is. What I would like to show our viewers and ask the question about is, this is going over 8 trillion euros now. Mm-hmm. And isn't what you just told us about the cryptocurrencies, don't we see a gigantic bubble here on your balance sheet with the euro? And isn't this graph very nerve-wracking?
Well, I can tell you that there is 0 crypto assets in the balance sheet of the ECB.
That I know.
Point number one. Well, I just don't want any ambiguity about it.
Yeah.
But you have to think in terms of counterfactual. If we had not decided on March 18th, when we put together the pandemic emergency program and then subsequently increased the volume of commitment that we made to the European Union economies, we would be in a devastated situation. So I don't regret any of that move that we took on that day, which was 4 months into my job, to significantly increase the size of the balance sheet, because that's all we had.
Yeah.
Otherwise, the economy would have collapsed and it would have been even accelerated by a financial crisis.
You had to do it. It was the COVID crisis. You say that's
yes.
what we needed to do. But how do you get it?
It will
back?
come. It will come. In due course. Yeah.
How?
In due course, it will come.
Yeah.
No,
but do you sleep at night when you see this?
Of course, I have to sleep at night. And I have to worry every morning. Yeah.
Lagarde knows what's at stake. You can feel the discomfort when the debt was addressed. Understand, to bring this level of debt back to something sustainable, we're talking about a Great Depression that will eclipse the 1920s Great Depression.
Despite the fact that those countries don't trust the United States, they trust each other less. And I'll be interested in the architecture of that develops. It's interesting that people who are proponents of that arrangement, and I'm frankly a proponent of that arrangement from a philosophical point of view, but they suggest that it'll be pegged to commodities. If you use the word pegged as opposed to use the word backed, I suspect that it will be pegged. That is to say, a promise to deliver commodities, as an example. What will actually occur, I think, is a series of formalized bilateral arrangements in currencies outside the US dollar, so that the US dollar can't be formally weaponized. I believe that any currency unit that developed outside of the US dollar for many, many, many years would actually end up being a currency that people traded into and out of, meaning that it would be converted to US dollars and back out of US dollars. As I say, my own experience has been that those countries which profess deserved distrust in the United States trust each other even less.
Nations cannot trust the U.S., but they also cannot trust each other. Rick Rule explains a system that is decentralized and money is backed by commodities. Protocols like the XRP ledger enable a system that Rick is describing.
About inflation to what's happened in Russia. One is the banking system. It's clear you can shut people out of the banking system. People hadn't realized you could do that so easily. Second is the confiscation, you could argue, or freezing of somebody's assets. Nobody had ever thought you could take the dollars in somebody's foreign reserve account and freeze them. And that's a big issue that the Chinese are obviously going to have to think about because they have $3.2 trillion in foreign reserves, and they're probably wondering, could this happen to us? And the third issue is the centrality of the dollar.
The world that does not align with the U.S. is fearful of the dollar hegemony. If you don't play ball, there is a risk your assets could be frozen. China holds trillions in U.S. debt, and that could be seized if they were to invade Taiwan. Recently, there was leaked audio suggesting China is close to invading Taiwan, and President Biden responded that they would defend Taiwan. Later, a U.S. military spokesperson cleared it up and said, "We would aid Taiwan with military supplies." Regardless if this was aid or defense, one thing is certain, that sanctions would apply.
But of course, the unintended consequence of this is that every country, regardless of whether it plans to invade or doesn't plan to invade, every politician, every leader in the world will now ask him or herself the question of whether Western financial institutions are trustworthy. And if it's not a question of invasion or annexation, maybe in 10 years it'll be a question of environmental issues. There are already articles coming out that are challenged, including in Foreign Affairs, that are challenging nations' sovereign rights over their environment. For example, what they choose or not choose to do with rainforests, rivers, mountains, and so on and so forth. Who's to say that in 10 or 15 years, countries' deposits won't be temporarily or partially frozen in exchange for their changing their attitude towards their domestic environmental policies. That's just one example. It could be anything else. So, one of the unintended consequences of this decision to freeze is that this will erode trust in the United States. And trust is ultimately the most important currency.
As sanctions continue, trust is lost. Normally, a country sanctions another, and that means businesses within that country can no longer trade with the other country. But with the dollar hegemony, the U.S. sanctioning means the whole world has to cut off that one nation that's sanctioned.
Meanwhile, we may be in a situation in which jurisdictions make decisions, but they do not underpin interoperability.
An open platform that is censorship resistant, where walled gardens have access to an internet of value. The walled gardens can create any rule they want within that garden. If one decided to sanction another country, they could, but they couldn't kick them off the open platform. Just prevent citizens from doing business with the sanctioned country.
Richer countries to stick to their pledges to support low-income countries. Two, for institutions like mine to, in relative terms, step up support for those who most need it. Last year, we did $650 billion new allocation of special drawing rights. This year, we are doing, for the first time, a massive transfer of special drawing rights from countries like France, that gets it, but has a great central bank and a policy is very, very sound policy. They don't need this so much. So France committed 20%, other countries followed. We are now moving this money to be able to support exactly what you're flagging, the tragedy of poor countries, often not by fault of their own, but by exogenous shocks, the COVID and now the war, to be able to sustain these shocks and secure, the livelihoods, the lives of their people.
As food prices and commodities soar, the developing nations' economies are being destroyed. The fact that the IMF is using the SDR means we are at the end game. The SDR is designed to bail countries out. It's a fresh balance sheet. In previous financial crises, the US bailed out the developing nations. Now the IMF is using the SDR. This tells me the US can no longer bail everyone out. Kristalina is concerned about life. We care about high costs, but developing countries will have to battle famine. Sri Lanka has accepted a loan from China. These countries will align with whoever they need to in order to survive.
Out of those economies are taking your business away from them.
So we're not exiting 13 countries.
So I read it wrong in the reports.
We open our bank stores in 97 countries every day. We operate 160, and we intend to stay that way.
So you are not selling the retail operations in Mexico, in China, in Russia,
I'm exiting a consumer business line to focus on the institutional clients that we serve in those countries, precisely because we see such growth in globalization. Our bank moves $4 trillion of volume a day in foreign exchange, cash management and trade. That number is going to be 10 trillion before we know it. It requires significant investment. So I think, like many industries and many different companies around the world, we all have to invest in digitization, in scaling up, in being able to operate with the scale and speed of a digital world.
Citibank is de-risking, meaning they're shutting down lines for cross-border payments. De-risking occurs when it becomes too costly for banks to move money due to KYC and AML information. As sanctions continue, the corresponding costs have gone up, as well as interest rates go up. The correspondents need to pay more interest if they borrow money in order to make the payment happen. Citi is saying they're shutting down cross-border payments in 13 jurisdictions for retail.
And yet we're still thriving as a company. We had a record year last year. We had a record Q1. Volume using our primary product of ODL grew 800% quarter Q1 to Q1.
ODL volume has grew 800% from quarter one to quarter one. As incumbents like Citi back out of retail cross-border payments, this means more business for Ripple. De-risking will continue because it's too costly in this environment of sanctions and high interest rates. The incumbents have massive lists of customers that they need to serve. If they can't offer a solution with correspondent banking, is it possible that they integrate with Ripple to serve their clients' needs?
Yes, central banks have a role. Private sector has a role. Private sector innovates much better than normally. Well, central banks innovate too, but private sector bursts with innovation. But central banks can bring this finality of payments that private sector really cannot, right?
I discovered that the study of past philosophers is of little use unless our own realities enter into it. Our realities alone allow the thinker's questions to become comprehensible. Thanks everyone, I hope you enjoyed the show. Please take a moment to like and subscribe. If you enjoy content like this, please consider joining my Patreon.